Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Dr. Jessica White. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Royal United Services Institute on the Terrorism and Conflict team, and I'm happy to be hosting you today for this webinar. We'll be launching a paper today, or a report, looking at Al-Shabaab and the 2022 Kenyan elections. Now, this report was written primarily by one of our research fellows out of our RUSI Nairobi office, Christopher Jaki, but he also had an excellent team in support of him, and we're going to be able to hear from them today. The report was funded by the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, a project that they fund called REINVENT, as well as UN Women. And we're going to get to hear a little introduction from our colleagues from those organizations as well today. The report is forthcoming in the next few weeks. It's not quite yet available online, but it will be published soon. And I'll put in the chat or the Q&A function for you today, the link at which you'll be able to find the paper here in the next the next few weeks. A few housekeeping rules, perhaps, to start with, and sort of the format that we'll follow today. Essentially, I'm going to do a little introduction for you. We'll get to hear a little bit of a welcome from our two funding bodies, and then we'll get to hear a panel discussion, essentially, about the report, the content of the report, and hear from the authors of the report. There will be time at the end for a question and answer session, a Q&A session. There should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we welcome you to put in questions as the panelists are speaking, as they occur to you, put them in there, and we'll come around at the end to address them. If there are questions already in that box that you think are good ones and you would like to hear them answered, there is a little choice to give a thumbs up on them. So please go ahead and do that, and that will sort of raise them to the top of the box so that I can be sure and put them to the panelists to be answered. So without further ado, I think we'll get started with a few housekeeping rules. The event is on the record, and it will be available. It's being recorded, and it will be available on RUSI's website after. So if you miss a little bit, you can come back and watch it again, or forward on to your colleagues the link to the website. And now I think let's go on to introductions. So let me start today with a couple of esteemed colleagues from our funding organizations. Let's start with Jaki Mbogo, who is the Chief of Party of the REINVENT program that works to promote peace and security across communities in 18 counties in Kenya. Through this program, she oversees the strengthening of national frameworks for enabling improved police security delivery, enhancing effective coordination and oversight and accountability and community engagement with security service providers. So Jaki, let me give you a few minutes just to say hello, a little bit about yourself and your interest in this research. And you're on mute still, Jaki. Apologies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And I take this opportunity to, on behalf of REINVENT, to welcome you all to this very, very important conversation as we launch this study on AS and the Kenya election. Of course, Kenya election is one very, very important conversation. And I do believe everybody in the room today is here because elections in particular present a very, very important dynamic for peace and security in Kenya. But before I get to that, I would like to probably just invite us all to this conversation by first articulating what REINVENT is about and why we are interested in this piece of work. So REINVENT is an FCDO-funded program that is managed by Tetra Tech International in partnership with RUSI. And we particularly partner to promote peace and security in the 18 counties that you mentioned. And we support the people and government of Kenya in particular to address and find solutions to criminal violence and intercommunal conflicts, preventing and countering violent extremism, gender-based violence, as well as election security, which is the basis of this study and why we got very, very interested in supporting RUSI to undertake this particular study. You will also know that REINVENT program supported in a very big way the 2022 election, especially police and IEBC, to be able to conduct a public order management SDBV response, and are therefore quite delighted that this study in a way also highlights the extent to which a lot of investment have been made and are paying off in terms of peace and security during elections in Kenya. So today's conversation, however, is important also for us because we need to understand and continually keep an eye on the intersectionalities of the threats and vulnerabilities that communities face during elections, before, during, and after. And because for us, elections present a flashpoint where all these vulnerabilities come together. And so for quite a number of years, we've been asking ourselves, do external actors have a role in peace and security during elections? Do they influence security? Do they even influence the voting dynamics of communities, especially those that are living under active threat of these communities? So this study, therefore, is important for us to begin lifting the lead on these issues and to begin to articulate those vulnerabilities and how best to then interweave them in programming so that we are most responsive when it comes to electoral security. We are delighted, having received the study, to note that first, the study confirms that investing in prevention and enabling enforcement mechanisms, law enforcement mechanism, is core to actually addressing vulnerabilities. And you will know the study does confirm that the threats came down in 2022 because there was better law enforcement engagement, community engagement, and that prevention then is actually the way we ought to be going. We're also very excited that the study shows that there is increased levels of resilience in community, because one of the core aspects of this program of REINVENT, or one of our objectives, is actually to build community resilience. So this study, in a way, then begins to prove to us that if we can invest in building community resilience, we are going to bring down the threats and the coming together of these vulnerabilities. Nevertheless, as I conclude, we appreciate the study has brought very important aspects that confirm why we need to invest in the manner we invest in peace and security. But what it's also telling us is it is not yet enough. We still need to do more to invest in prevention, to invest in accountable policing response, and to invest in community engagement, especially to anticipate and preempt any conceivable threats that such groups as AS pose. So as we come to this conversation and welcome you all to the conversation, I think it's also to ask each of us who are programming in this area to continue paying more attention to how do we, in the future, manage potential threats, coming together of these threats, and how would we invest in systems and structures that can make law enforcement even better and community resilience stronger. Thank you very much, Jessica. And I'm very, very delighted to be here and welcome everybody again on behalf of the REINVENT team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaki. I think that's a really useful introduction to REINVENT. Next, let me welcome Pereira from the UN Women. She's our strategic policy advisor in peace and governance with over 2 decades of experience in international conflict resolution and political transitions. She specializes in negotiating and implementing governance, rule of law, and democratization portfolios, as well as anchoring, preventing, and countering violent extremism perspectives in the women, peace, and security agenda. Maria, would you like to give us an introduction? Oh, I'm sorry, Marta, I apologize.
Hello, everyone. It is a real pleasure to have you and women contributing to this project of Al-Shabaab and the 2022 elections in Kenya. And I will highlight the gender analysis that UN Women has supported on the impact of voting. And it is a great pleasure to be alongside and being implemented by RUSI. I would like to start off the UN Women's interest on this specific topic of security. Together with CEDAW and the Beijing platform have been the international policy and the framework for women, peace, and security. Hello? I think there was a cut on my internet.
Yeah, you're back with us, Marta. You can go ahead again.
I'm not. Okay, apologies. So I was just providing a little bit of a context of the interest of women on the prevention of violent extremism. So I will take it from there. So UN Women is interested in promoting gender equality and strengthening women's participation and the protection of rights across the conflict cycle, from the prevention component to the post-conflict and reconstruction. We also are very interested on the gendered phenomenon that terrorism and violent extremism bring, and how women, men, boys, and girls experience.
Unfortunately, Marta, we've lost you a little bit again. You were saying how women,
Sorry,
men, and boys
it has
and
been
girls.
a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Would you like to pick it up again, Marta?
Okay, apologies, this is always internet challenge. Yes, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
I wanted to give an example of how boys and girls and women and men experience this phenomenon differently. And I will share with you just a personal experience being a woman working in the security realm. So some years back in a high security meeting, one of the security officers come to me and say, "Do you have a weapon?" And I said, "Yes, I have." And of course, the security guy looked at me and said immediately, "So you give me your weapon. You cannot get into this meeting with a weapon." And I said, "I cannot give you my weapon because my weapon is my intelligence." And he didn't understand my joke because he was so focused on guns. Because for men, this security field, weapons are guns, and guns are power. And therefore, women that usually do not have access to what they would say guns, the weapons available to women in that context are completely different. So you would have persuasion, resilience, and other ways that women will be able to navigate that realm. And so this is a good example of how important on the need of having gender disaggregated data, and also how UN Women felt so proud to be able to contribute with the gender disaggregated perception survey to put in evidence the difference in priorities and the interests between men and women. And that surfaced so nicely on this research. I'm sure that Timothy will go into, Christopher and Timothy will go into the details of the survey, so I will not spend time on this, but it does bring, this brings and creates the imperative for governments to apply conscious and systematic gender-sensitive approaches in their prevention and in their responses to combat and prevent violent extremism and terrorism. And this would be applicable not only to the government on the terrorist realm, but also on the law enforcement agencies and across the whole security sector. So then we would be able to recognize the different roles and levels of women and girls that are involved as victims, perpetrators, and agents of change.
Marta, that was actually a great end of your sentence.
Apologies, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a challenge. I was just about to then end this by saying that UN Women in Kenya has been working alongside the Kenya government, and more specifically with the National Counterterrorism Center, since 2016. We target co-creation and joint initiatives to advance the agenda of women, peace, and security in Kenya. And the beginning of April this year, so just recently,
Marta, we're losing you again. I wonder if maybe we should go on because we can't hear you at all now. All right, I'm going to say apologies. Oh, there you are, Marta. If you could try and wrap it up in a few words, then we might get the last few words here.
Yes, I apologize. I'm not sure if you heard our engagement with the National Counterterrorism Center, and just to finalize, mention that we have been working alongside the government since 2016, and recently we just signed a memorandum of understanding with the National Counterterrorism Center, which is really groundbreaking advancement on having gender at the centerpiece of policy and programming in Kenya. And this is specifically important since in the security realm, which is still a very male-oriented space and where gender inequality is significant. Therefore, it is a pleasure for UN Women to have established a framework to continue to support women and girls impacted by terrorism and violent extremism in Kenya, and to contribute to their community resilience while working in prevention. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the study and the presentation.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was really interesting, and apologies to the audience. We were really interested to hear from Marta. With the internet connection made it a little bit difficult, but I think she made some really great points there about UN Women's interest in the research. So let me just give a couple minutes of quick sort of introduction to what we're going to talk about, introduction to what the research looked at, and then we'll pass it right over to the panel to get their perspectives on the writing up of the report. So really, in thinking about Al-Shabaab and Kenyan elections, we have to recognize that general elections represent the foundation of inclusive democracy, right? So when groups are fundamentally opposed to democracy, elections become an opportunity then to undermine that process and to undermine their adversaries and promote their own agenda. So the report looks at the efforts of Al-Shabaab to influence the elections. Primary data was gathered for the report in the forms of a security incident data monitoring, so looking at whether there were incidents of violence, and also this perception study that Marta referred to that was done amongst Kenyan voters in areas affected by Al-Shabaab, and a gendered analysis of that perception study, and sort of a focus on understanding the differences in perspectives between men, women, and other marginalized communities in those counties. And so many different aspects were explored, whether there was targeted violence or whether there was propaganda focusing on influencing voting patterns. However, I think, as Jaki alluded to, the perception study found that while people recognized Al-Shabaab as a threat, they didn't necessarily change their voting due to Al-Shabaab's efforts. So the study offers an interesting and unique opportunity to explore some of the nuance of voting choices amongst different portions of the population, mostly impacted by Al-Shabaab, and looking at the difference of their choices, obviously between the differences between men and women, but also the differences between urban and rural environments, and some of these other influencing factors on voting choices, the understandings of security and insecurity, and how those impact choices. So I think, let's go ahead and go on to our panel. We're going to hear from a great panel today, those who helped to feed into and support the writing of the report. And let me just, for the sake of time, introduce them as a bunch, and then we can move through them and their presentations. So today on the panel, we're going to have Ahmed Hassan, who is the CEO of Great Dynamics. We're going to have Kimaiyo, who is a project assistant at RUSI Nairobi, and Christopher Jaki, who is the primary author of the report and a research fellow out of RUSI Nairobi. And please remember that you can feel free to populate your questions in that question and answer box as they are speaking, and then we can come to the questions after the presentations about the content of the report. So my panelists, if I could get you to please turn on your cameras, and Ahmed will come to you first for the presentation about your portion of the report.
Thank you, Jessica. So yeah, my name is Ahmed Hassan. I'm the CEO of Great Dynamics. Grid Dynamics is an intelligence and research firm based in London, but we have a team across the world, and we are obviously very interested in sub-Saharan Africa, and in this case, the Horn of Africa. We look at things around irregular warfare, as well as strategic and political risk. For this piece of work, I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit fast because there's a lot to talk about. We conducted 3 pieces of work that fed into this report. One was a security analysis monitoring that we've conducted from January of 2022 up to September of 2022, looking at Al-Shabaab terrorist activity, as well as propaganda and law enforcement responses. Secondly, we looked at a historical theoretic report looking at Al-Shabaab activities during the previous 2 elections of 2013 and 2017. And some comparative studies to other groups, such as the Taliban, some groups in Lebanon and Boko Haram in Nigeria. And finally, we conducted a final report end of last year that looked at all the security incidents of 2022 and the attempts of Al-Shabaab through terrorist violence. We saw some interesting things happen in last year's elections that we haven't, I don't think they've been really captured in data before. That speaks to another point that I will make in a second about the quality of data that we have today compared to 10 years ago, where we saw on the terrorist activity, we saw Al-Shabaab going into villages and lecturing populations not to vote and not to participate in the voting. And on the propaganda side, we saw a renewed focus on Al-Shabaab talking to Swahili-speaking audiences to join the fight in Somalia as well as in Kenya. So those are very interesting points, a couple of points that we saw in our data. And as I said, the research was very interesting for us to do because we're a private organization. I think private organizations should be involved in these types of discussions and researches. And the one thing that we hoped we could have done a little bit better was that the data was just, there was so much, and sadly there was not that much data in 2013 and 17 to compare with, even though we tried. And if anybody's interested in that data, we will also make that public so people can look at it for themselves. And lastly, I wanted to thank RUSI, and in particular Christopher Hockey and Martina Zerten for all their support and all the late night phone calls for deadlines. And I want to thank the people in my team that are not here today, Abby Clark, Ethan Learens, and Michael Elmer, who have all 3 been rock stars in this process for the last more than 12 months. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions. And back to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was a great introduction, I think, to sort of the security monitoring end of the report. Timothy, can we come to you next, please?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Ahmed. My name is Timothy Kimaiyo, and I'm an economist by profession. And in this study, I manage the data collection for the fieldwork. I'll share with you the methodology that we followed just to assess the extent to which Al-Shabaab influenced the general election of last year in the 4 counties of Lamu, Wajir, Mandera, and Garissa. So I'll share with my screen. I hope you can all see this. Good. It's all good now? Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just share the methodology, the survey methodology that we followed, and then Topher will come later with the findings, more like summarizing what Ahmed has spoken about and what we got from this quantitative survey. So we targeted only adults aged 18 years as at the date the mass voter registration ended. So that was on 6th of February 2022 in the 4 counties of Lamu, Wajir, Mandera, and Garissa. So the approach that we took was, especially now the sampling approach that we took was multi-stage sampling. So we went to the 2019 Kenya population household survey data, and then we did what we call quota sampling. So we look at the population of the adults, and then we kind of perform some quota, but again we later realized that the population in Lamu was quite low, so we kind of narrowed Lamu because of the 2 counties. We went to another level. It's called now the second stage level. So these are at the sub-county level, and then now the very last sampling we did at the locations. So the locations are our sampling point, and for the locations we use the probability proportional sampling technique, so that we wanted to just reduce bias in sampling. But in doing this, because of the need to do no harm and accessibility in some areas, we spoke to the local researchers, that data collectors that we had employed, who knew the language, the culture, and the area well. So we avoided some areas because of that, just to ensure that safety for respondents and safety for the research team. But now in selecting the households, it was purely random. So we use what we call the left-hand rule. So in the sampling point, or at the location that was identified, so the enumerator will identify a landmark, for example, a mosque or a church, and then that enumerator will use the day code. So for example, if today is 12th, that enumerator will add 1 + 2, and then we'll get 3, and then we'll skip every 3rd household. So we'll go to the 4th. But that enumerator will maintain that road on the using his on the left side until that sampling area is exhausted, given the sample that we had allocated. This was just to ensure there's randomness in the selection of the households. More so, within the households, we also did random selection. So the enumerator will go to that household, list all the members of that household, and use a kiss grid to identify only one member to be interviewed. In all this, we did not collect any personal identifiable information. So the survey was purely anonymous. No contacts were taken, no names were taken. This was just to kind of make the respondents quite comfortable and just share their perceptions about whether Al-Shabaab influenced Kenya elections, the general elections in the stated counties. So probably that's the approach that we followed. I'll just speak to the sample because it's quite important. So in Lamu, we went to Lamu East and Lamu West, so those 2 sub-counties that are in Lamu, and in total we interviewed 81 respondents in Lamu, and then in Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera, the number of respondents were quite similar, 151, 160, and 156. But the specific locations where we went to is shown on that map. So you could see, for example, we did not go to Fafi at that time because it was not very secure. So we excluded Fafi, for instance, in our data collection exercise. So in total, the findings that Tofu will be speaking about emanated from 552 respondents or data points. Quickly about just the characteristics of the people that we talked to. Overall, men were 58%, just about or close to 3 out of 5 were men, and 42% were women. And then in terms of age, because we focus on the adults only, as of the end of mass registration, 44% were within the age of 25 and 34 years. And this was more like consistent in the 4 counties. So there's no more like county-wide variations in terms of the age of the respondents. We also asked some household information, for example, household size. The average household size was 5.2, and in Lamu specifically was 4. And this was really close to the last census that was done, the 2019 Kenya population housing census. But in Garissa, Wajir, and Mandera, these numbers were quite low as compared to the national household size that is out there. But again, we understand the nature and the nature of the communities in these northeastern counties, because they sometimes tend to move. So, and also even the numbers in the population survey is quite debatable. Actually, the people living in those communities, in those areas, in a way, dispute the figures. But overall, the average household size was 5.2. We had also some questions around disability, and 13%. So we asked whether there's a member who is disabled in our household, and 13% said yes. This is also close to other surveys that has been established in the country. Even the recent one in the 2022 Kenya Demographic Household Survey, about 16% of the households found to have a member with some sort of disability. And the most common were hearing, walking, and climbing. Yeah, I'll invite Tofa to take it from here, but we'll come back for maybe in the time of question and answers.
Great. Thank you, Timothy. That was a really useful introduction to the methodology of the reports. Topher, I think we can come to you now. You're on mute.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. If you just give me 1 second to share my screen. Apologies. Thank you. So I hope you can all see my screen now. And welcome. My name is Christopher Hockey. I'm a research fellow based here in Nairobi, in RUSI's Nairobi office. As you can see from these various introductions, this study brought together a huge amount of information, but also several different organizations, often with slightly different agendas. So it was quite a complex study. We're relatively short on time, so I'll try and provide an overview of the main findings and try and bring everything together that you've heard so far. To start with, I'd want to just introduce the research questions. The inspiration for this study really began in early 2022, well before the elections. And we recognized that evidence from 2013 and 2017 electoral cycles suggested that Al-Shabaab were acutely aware of the significance of Kenya's democratic process, especially for their own ability to continue operating in Kenya. In 2017, for example, Al-Shabaab had launched a series of propaganda communications directly targeting the electorate, asking them to boycott the polls and at the same time urging them to vote for candidates that would withdraw Kenyan troops. They also attacked candidates in the northeast, with the governor of Mandera attacked on several occasions, and even stole an electronic voter kit. So we started this research sort of recognizing that the group was well aware and was probably increasingly likely to try and interfere with the polls in 2022. We wanted to look at the group's capabilities and interests in influencing proceedings. So the two main questions were, one, how did Al-Shabaab respond to the elections last year in terms of both propaganda and terrorist activity? And secondly, was the group able to influence the outcome in any way or the level of participation, either nationally or locally? In order to answer these questions, as you've just heard, there were several methods used. So there was an extensive literature review with Al-Shabaab activity in previous years, and reports on that explored at length, as well as studies on Al-Shabaab propaganda and efforts to theorize militant group relationships with democracy. We also conducted our own analysis of Al-Shabaab propaganda. As you've heard from Ahmed, we analyzed kinetic activity from Al-Shabaab within Kenya throughout the year through monthly reporting. There was a gender-sensitive perception study, which we've heard introduced by Timo and Marta, and this really focused on understanding how Al-Shabaab activity was interpreted and understood by local communities and whether this impacted their voting preferences. Kenya provides a really unusual case study for this study, or a really useful and unique case study, at least in this for these questions. Firstly, it's an opportunity to explore how a VE group in a neighboring nation state could seek to influence elections across the border. As an Islamist group, Al-Shabaab, to an extent, are distinct from other insurgencies, and their ambitions and strategies are closely tied with an ideological opposition to democracy. So in that sense, they're an anti-system group. But at the same time, they also have political and strategic ambitions in Kenya that need to be recognized. And we looked at both throughout the study. The study was conducted, obviously, in a historically marginalized community, and a community in which we wanted to understand the willingness to engage in the state building process. And finally, the study, through its sort of longitudinal approach, allowed us to explore changes in Al-Shabaab activity in line with local perceptions, in line with local political developments and perceptions of those. So the study started with a sort of discussion of the relationship between terrorism and democracy. Several options are available to terrorist groups during democratic processes at a nation-state level. They may seek to disrupt the electoral process, as ISIS and the Taliban and Boko Haram have done. This disruption could serve to demonstrate the weakness, for example, in the system, in the democratic system, and alleged failures of the state to protect their citizens. But they may also look to influence the outcomes of the election, the actual results, as the Taliban and Boko Haram have evidently done as well. In other cases, they may seek to participate, and as is often the case with Al-Shabaab in Kenya, they may seek to provoke a response from law enforcement in order to gain further support. They could also do multiple of these things at the same time, as indeed Al-Shabaab seemed to have done in Kenya in 2013, calling for the boycott at the same time as seeking to influence voters in selections through propaganda. And what means are available to terrorist groups? Well, there's indiscriminate violence, as we've seen in many cases in larger urban settlements in Kenya, but also more discriminate violence involving sort of targeting of law enforcement, for example, or state officials. They also can use intimidation and propaganda. And all these options have been seen in other contexts, including Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Our study, in addition to the last two elections, reviewed Al-Shabaab activity during Somali elections over the last decade. So ultimately, moving into the findings, what could Al-Shabaab have actually done in advance of the 2022 elections? They could have exploited security vacuums as law enforcement were moved to secure the polling process. They could have launched large-scale complex attacks in urban centers. They could also have harassed or intimidated voters near the border. They could have targeted certain communities to displace populations and therefore manipulate results, as we've seen historically alleged in parts of northeastern Kenya. And finally, they could have used the elections to increase their recruitment efforts by targeting those who are most disenfranchised by the process. But actually, if we turn to what we found in our study, Al-Shabaab were relatively quiet in 2022 compared to previous electoral cycles, at least in terms of their propaganda. What information was released by the group, and the communications really focused on the same things we've seen year on year for the last decade. So demands for Kenya's withdrawal, claims that Kenya's military had failed, for example, in Somalia. But on the 27th of August, a more significant statement was released. This was released shortly before the Supreme Court made its sort of landmark ruling on the poll results. And in this, Shabaab directly addressed the Kenyan administration and renewed their demands for the government to withdraw defense personnel from Somalia. The full statement really demonstrates how closely the group had been following political developments in Kenya, describing our new president as a chicken seller, for example, and also reporting directly on campaign promises made by all candidates. But perhaps more significant in terms of propaganda was a push in late 2021, early 2022, which was really a push at recruiting Kenyan and Tanzanian Swahili speakers into the group, following a period of several years in which recruitment from East Africa seemed to be down the priority list. Between December 2021 and February 2022, just over 2 months, the group released 14 videos as part of its Inspire the Believer series. And this image here shows several snapshots from those videos. In these videos, male-speaking Swahili fighters from Kenya and Tanzania encouraged those back home to join the group. Turning to the incident analysis and the security assessments we conducted throughout the year, the security analysis conducted throughout the year. Firstly, it's really worth noting that significantly more attacks were conducted in 2022 than in any previous year. There was 146 incidents in our database compared to just 83 in 2021 and 107 in 2020. Obviously, our collection efforts were stepped up, as Ahmed has described, but the increase is still really quite striking. And activity throughout the year is outlined in detail in the report. But I want to focus on a certain period where you can see there was a little spike in activity in the period between June and August, in the 3 months leading up to the elections. And over this period, several incidents directly related to the elections. So there were incidents in which militants addressed residents after attacks, urging them not to participate in the upcoming polls. There was attacks against a police vehicle escorting a parliamentary candidate in Ijara in June. Another attack against a KDF election security vehicle in Wajir in June. And in July, a vehicle transporting supporters of the opposition party was attacked in Ramu, Mandera. And then in the week leading up to the elections in August, there was several incidents of note. Firstly, a vehicle carrying election workers was targeted in Mandera. A polling center in quite murky circumstances was allegedly targeted in Warabeo in Mandera. And then in August, a truck and motorcycle transporting, in the day before the elections in August, a truck and motorcycle transporting ballot boxes was targeted in Korofara in Wajir. So there was consistent activity, especially in the 4 weeks leading up to the elections and the election day itself and the week following. And over this period, attacks do seem to have been a little bit more discriminate, with fewer incidents targeting civilians. There was then a significant decline after that 5-week period. However, ultimately, our paper argues that there was very little evidence of a coordinated effort to disrupt the process. The attacks I've described were largely sporadic and largely isolated. They were mostly pretty small in scale and opportunistic. And there was more incidents, as you saw in this graph I just showed you, in January than any other month of the year, but also more incidents in February and December than there was actually in that period over the elections themselves. So that period wasn't necessarily that unusual for that period, middle of the year every year. It's also worth noting that there was no actual attacks confirmed by Al-Shabaab on election day itself. And before I move on, I want to just focus quickly on law enforcement. Additional presence of security agents was reported, obviously, in the Northeast throughout the election period. And our key informant interviews really praised their presence at polling stations, suggested they made them feel safe, and at least when they were actually at the station voting. And we also reported several significant operations in January and February involving raids on AS camps, arrests, the interdictions of logistics routes, and weapons seizures. And it does seem that these law enforcement operations in sort of January to March last year had some impact on the ability of Shabaab to operate. And then in July, a month before the elections, a significant incident in the Boni Forest led to the death of 10 Shabaab operatives at a camp. 2022 was a really quite turbulent year for Al-Shabaab. And it's difficult to argue that the increase in absolute number of incidents that we reported was connected to the elections in any way. Many other factors influence Al-Shabaab activity, including their access to resources and the situation in Somalia. But the year for Al-Shabaab involved a series of pretty significant events. One was the Somali political transition, which happened several months before the Kenya elections. Al-Shabaab launched major operations in Ethiopia in what was seen as sort of a first in August, the same month as the elections in Kenya. Drought became increasingly more problematic throughout the year. And perhaps most significantly, August was the month that the Somali government and clan militia launched an offensive across the Al-Shabaab region. So ultimately, it seems that the Kenyan elections may have fallen down in the order of priorities for the group. And now, and perhaps most significantly and most interestingly from this research is a look at perceptions amongst the electorate and the extent to which what we've just seen actually impacted the elections itself. We use two approaches to try to better understand the impact of Al-Shabaab attacks and propaganda and presence on the electorate across the 4 northeastern counties. One was the key informant interviews, which Grey Dynamics conducted for us. And the second was a series of a fairly large-scale survey across the 4 counties, which Timo has introduced. The questions in this survey looked at factors influencing voter preferences, as well as security concerns of all those spoken to. And all results were gender disaggregated. There's a huge amount of detail and a wealth of information from this. So I'm only going to focus on a few sort of key takeaways. Starting with political participation, we found a really quite active population politically. 91% said they were registered to vote, and interestingly, higher proportions of women than men said that they were registered. The vast majority of these that were registered then confirmed that they had actually exercised the democratic right on election day. Over 1/3 said that they would consider standing as candidates in future elections. Interestingly, that this was a higher proportion of men than women who answered in the affirmative, which is a concern, and the study does explore the low participation of women in politics in Kenya. As for security concerns, there was clearly a lot of fear during the election period. Only 16% said they were not concerned at all, with most saying that they were concerned at least to some extent over their own personal safety during the polls. 28% of those who were concerned identified Shabaab as their greatest concern, and notably more in Lamu and Mandera, the 2 counties where we had greater frequency of attacks, noted Shabaab as their main concern. Ultimately, and perhaps not surprisingly though, many more cited political violence as their greatest fear. Also of note was that only 2% said that they knew of people who had received Al-Shabaab information relating to the elections. And it's worth noting that the KIIs praised the presence, as I've said already, of law enforcement at polling stations. So how do these security concerns perhaps impact voting decisions? Almost half of all respondents voted for candidates that they chose because of promises of employment, and other significant reasons included campaign manifestos or political messaging, or saying that they voted with their clan or community. No respondents at all said they were coerced or threatened, and no respondents at all suggested Al-Shabaab influenced them not to vote. Women were much more likely to vote based on issues, so issues such as employment, whereas males were found to be much more likely to vote with their clan or community. The most commonly identified actors influencing voting decisions were family, clan elders, politicians, and friends, but more men than women identified clan elders, and many more women than men mentioned politicians and friends. And finally, only 2% of respondents in Mandera and 1% in Garissa said that Al-Shabaab had been an influence in any way on their decision. This amounts to about 17 individuals. So as a result of all these different components of the study, we've drawn several conclusions. In answer to the first question that I introduced, Al-Shabaab's direct response to the 2022 elections was relatively minimal. There were fewer propaganda messages released, as we've seen, and attacks were not conducted at an intensity capable of disrupting the polling process. Law enforcement likely limited Al-Shabaab's capability and freedom to operate. And despite a marked history and reputation over the last couple of decades along the border, well, the last 50 years along the border, their measured approach during the elections does seem to have served to build trust. And in answer to The second question, despite evidence of significant fear of Al-Shabaab along the border, these considerations did not necessarily impact voting preferences. So there was no respondents who said they were coerced, as I've said, or threatened to vote in a certain way. Only 2% knew of people who had received information. Not a single said they didn't vote because of Al-Shabaab. Not a single responded. And finally, and only a very, very negligible number, as we've seen, said that Shabaab had influenced their decision in any way. Ultimately, this suggests a remarkable level of resilience amongst the communities that we studied, and a continued commitment in the Northeast counties and Lamu to the democratic cause. Clearly, factors other than insecurity drive voting preferences, and these are clearly really gendered factors. However, we do note that further research is needed into Al-Shabaab's more subtle or indirect influences. It's possible, for example, that certain clan elders who are identified as influential may have themselves have responded differently to questions over their own influence. And the findings bode well for the future of democracy in Kenya, but we need to recognize that efforts to devolve powers to the counties, as has been ongoing and is evolving over the last 12 years, must be maintained. And finally, before we turn to Q&A, some recommendations. These are elaborated in much greater detail in the report, but I want to highlight a few major points that we think are worth noting. Firstly, for government, we suggest that, unsurprisingly, that they continue strengthening democracy in northeastern counties, because it's clear that there is a desire amongst the electorate to be involved in politics. Secondly, we suggested that they consider really carefully how to communicate with those in the peripheries, especially those affected by violent extremism, because the respondents suggested that they really do listen to political messaging. Thirdly, we suggest that more opportunities need to be created for the empowerment of women in politics. And communications is especially important at the time when the border starts to be reopened in the next few months. As for law enforcement, we suggest that they recognize that trust with communities in the peripheries can only be built through impartial security provision. And secondly, that they consider options for increasing the representation of women in security agencies. Oh, sorry. Civil society, we again urge them to consider options for encouraging women to run for all offices, not just the MCA positions, not just the women's rep positions, but also positions of member of the county assembly, which most were much more enthusiastic about. We also suggest that the civil society consider integrating civic education into existing programs with a focus on increasing the political participation of women in marginalized groups. And finally, civil society should collaborate with the government over the reopening of the border, offering research, for example, raising awareness and conducting needs assessments as necessary. And finally, for researchers, the study really demonstrated that a survey, a gender-disaggregated survey of this nature, can reveal a huge amount of data, and that was with a relatively modest sample. But it posed lots of questions which we thought could only really be answered with a larger sample. So unsurprisingly, the first recommendation is that the survey be expanded. Secondly, we stress that researchers need to recognize the utility of security analysis and the usefulness of maintaining data, especially incident data that is gender sensitive and gender disaggregated. Too rarely, especially in Eastern Africa, this data is simply not available or is inconsistent. Thirdly, and actually the remaining points really focus on further research that we think is needed for an exploration of the potential indirect influence of Shabaab on communities, a study into the gendered perceptions of security, including understandings of Al-Shabaab as a threat, because it seems from the results that women were in some cases more concerned by the threat of Al-Shabaab and the messaging they produced. And finally, the survey revealed a huge amount of data on factors that influence electoral decision-making, but at the same time, we weren't really able to explore that because it wasn't directly relevant to the study. So I think further studies into how communities in peripheries in sort of an area which is still sort of coming to terms with devolution and influences on decision-making in that context need to be further explored. So thank you very much, Jess. And I think we open up to Q&A at this point.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Topher, for that really useful overview, I think, of what the report will show. And our colleague has put the link to the website in the chat, where you can see that it will be published here in the next few coming weeks at that on that website, as well as on the RUSI website will be linked there. One question I think that would be good to just put right to you, Topher, is in our audience asked about whether you looked at the difference between how Al-Shabaab potentially affected voting decisions in 2017 versus 2022. Sort of, did you see an evolution of that effort?
Yeah, thanks, Razia. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, firstly, obviously the survey, we only have the data for 2022. So in terms of the actual impact on voting decisions, we don't have that data for 2017. But what we did very clearly have is a much more active Al-Shabaab directly relevant to the elections over this period in 2017. There was a huge amount of propaganda released over the 2017 election, which has been written about at length, and a huge amount of violence that sort of directly targeted candidates, for example. So it was there clearly seemed to be more coordinated response in 2022 than in 2017, but how that actually impacted population and their responses, their voting preferences, it would be wonderful to have that data, but we don't.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Topher. We have another question, and please let me just say to everyone, please do populate any questions that you have in the question and answer box. We have our whole team here. All panelists can respond to the questions as needed. A question from Martin on what can be done about the bias caused by having to avoid dangerous places. So potentially sort of the impact of what security incidents did happen. Did that impact people's feelings about going to certain places and potentially places where they needed to vote?
I think Timo would have some answers to that as well, but I'll start. We discussed this issue, Martin, at length in the report. There's also an interesting graph, a map that maybe I should have shown here, which demonstrates sort of incidents in the sub-counties in which we conducted the survey. So there was obviously a balance in making sure that our enumerators were safe, but also making sure the study was relevant. And there was an ongoing back and forth between us and the enumerators and the survey provider over how direct we could be in our questioning. And I think the answer to your question is really about just that. Can you use proxies, for example, in some of the most exposed areas? So in this case, Koraf Hara, as Timo mentioned, I don't think we know the study was conducted in Hlugo, so in some areas which really were high risk locations in Mandera East, but areas like Koraf Hara, where over the last 2 years has been the sort of the epicenter of Shabaab activity in Kenya, or at least cross-border attacks, we were simply unable to do it. The enumerators understandably didn't want to put themselves at risk. So I think the answer to your question is probably around more proxy related questions, not using words like Al-Shabaab. We were very insistent that Shabaab had to be labeled and named in the survey, because otherwise we wouldn't really get to the points we wanted to the actual issues we wanted to get to. The RUSI is just maybe just to plug this. RUSI is just starting now and leading the research component of CSSF's new Borderlands program over the next 3 years. And this study really wants to get to exactly those places. So Gorile, Diff, Lafi, Hlugo, Koraf Hara, Kiunga, and Lamu, for example. So these are exactly the areas. So your question is something we're going to have to explore a lot more over the next few months. And I think the answer is not necessarily increased security, because you do not get better answers if you provide enumerators armed with armed security. But yeah, it would be great to talk further about that question. Timo, do you have anything to add?
not really. I think Topher, you have captured everything, perhaps. So we actually try to go us to those areas, and actually, like Topher has mentioned, we wanted the name to remain, like, for example, Al-Shabaab influence. So first, that was clear from the start. But also, like, for example, we went up to Olugo, which is actually on the border. And maybe just going forward, perhaps we could maybe use enumerate as railway station in those kind of areas, and then, of course, apply ethical considerations. But yeah, I think that's perhaps what we can do going forward. Yeah, but for this one, we just wanted to do, of course, don't do no harm, and also just ensure that everyone is safe. And yeah.
Thanks, both. I think we can go on to the next question. Please feel free, Ahmed, too, if you have any responses that you want to give, just jump in. Did you want to respond to that one?
No, I wanted to say on the regions that Topher mentioned, that I think using proxies is a good idea, and to get access.
Great, thanks. Let's go on to the next question. We have a question from Phyllis, who is wondering about whether Al-Shabaab was able to sort of influence the registration of voters in counties of focus for the reports. I don't know, Topher, if you wanted to respond on that at all.
I mean, we didn't ask questions directly relating to that, and the study did focus only on those who were at voting age at the time of registration. So there was already an effort to only target those who could have registered. But we then did ask a question that was, if people said they had not registered, we did ask them why they had not. It didn't explicitly mention Shabaab, but it did ask why they hadn't registered. And in many cases, it was, they were sick, or they were too late, or there was some sort of administrative issue that they couldn't do so. Obviously, concerningly, in many cases, it was, I did not have an ID, I didn't have and I couldn't register for that reason. No one said I did not register because Shabaab told me not to. However, some did say some pretty sort of candid answers, pretty frank answers about, I didn't believe in the system, for example. I didn't believe in that my vote would make a difference. So theoretically, I suppose you could conceivably suggest that sort of Shabaab influence could drive that, but I'm sure you'd get similar answers all over Kenya or all over any country, any democracy in the world, people who don't believe that their vote would make a difference. So broadly speaking, we didn't find any evidence that Shabaab had been involved in preventing people register, or in pushing people to register, for example. We could have asked that question more directly, but we didn't.
I think from my perspective, as somebody who helped a little bit with the reports, this was one of those questions that could have been explored or could be explored as part of an extension of the study, because I think there was quite a bit of interest in looking too about voter preferences and voter behaviors, and sort of looking at understanding better why different parts of the population vote in ways, or register to vote, what their hopes are for participating in the political system. We saw quite a bit of difference indicated between men and women and other marginalized communities. And I think that maybe links in with the next question from Mark about what the connection was, in the survey, between the survey asking about people with disabilities and the influence of Al-Shabaab. And I think this is part of trying to implement that intersectional gendered analysis into the perception study, and trying to understand, was the perception of men and the insecurity they potentially felt from Al-Shabaab different than that of women, or different than that of people with disabilities, or of other marginalized communities, and trying to make that part of the assessment of Al-Shabaab's influence. Was it felt differently by different parts of the community? And I think that's something that often is overlooked in the security space more generally. We often focus on the perceptions of men without really considering that the perceptions of people with disabilities or other marginalized people in the community would have a different perception of that insecurity, or potential insecurity. I don't know, Topher, if you wanted to add any more on that. That was just part of the report that I helped with a little bit.
I actually think Marta might have a comment on that, because she was quite keen to have the disability question included as a sort of, yeah, as you say, a further extension of the intersectionality component of the study.
Not sure, Marta, if you have internet, do you want to respond to that at all? I know we had a little bit of trouble with Marta's internet earlier.
Yes, no, thank you very much for the interest. Yes, I think you covered very nicely, Jessica. We were looking at covering because gender is not synonymous only to women. So therefore we wanted to cover as much as we could on other communities and how could that impact differently. So we did have, as Tafa mentioned, a limitation on the number of questions. So this also brings us to the idea that much more would be, I mean, this is the initial research, but much more can be based on this, can be developed, and we are looking forward for the opportunity also to contribute to subsequent research that will bring a little bit more flesh also on the initial findings on this particular research. Over to you.
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, I think there's a great deal that can be explored in more depth on the sort of the fascinating way in which the gender dynamics and dynamics of different intersecting inequalities impact why and how people vote. That's perhaps a little bit tangential to the influence of Al-Shabaab, but is very much impacted by how people perceive insecurity. Another question from Martin, sort of about, I think, the overall finding, Topher, of how much influence did they actually have? Did Al-Shabaab actually have on the voting process? And perhaps, I don't know if you want to try and speculate any further than that on the political policies of the Kenyan government around voting.
I mean, as you recognize, it's a difficult question to answer, but I'll answer it from the context of this study and then maybe just pose some thoughts on the broader issue of Shabaab's efforts to influence Kenyan policy. On the first question relating to this study, broadly we found that they did not succeed. There was minimal evidence from any respondents that they had influenced voting preferences at any level. As we said, that there is some need to expand that to whether there's sort of more indirect influence on the sort of information space and on whether perceptions, as another recent RUSI study demonstrated, whether sort of social ecology is influenced in some way by Al-Shabaab. But what our study found really that the group had minimal to no impact on the elections in the Northeast, and there's no reason to believe otherwise anywhere else in the country. In terms of Shabaab's influence on Kenyan policies more broadly, their efforts are very straightforward. All Shabaab want to do is, in their propaganda, the messaging is remove Kenyan troops from Somalia, stressing that Kenya's presence in Somalia has somehow undermined security at home, suggestions that those on the coast and in the Northeast and Muslim populations in Kenya as a whole have suffered as a result of Kenya's presence in Somalia. And if that's their sole aim, to try and influence Kenyans to withdraw from Somalia, or at least maybe beyond that, withdraw or occupation, so-called occupation in the Northeast, or occupation of Muslim lands, then they're failed. So there's no real evidence that Shabaab have in any way influenced Kenya's policy. And actually, Kenya has now sent additional troops to Somalia to support the offensive in Jubaland that's due to begin at some point outside of ATMIS. So yeah, I suppose on that basis alone, it's pretty good evidence that they have not succeeded in any way. But obviously, in terms of maintaining its level of attacks and the frequency of attacks in Kenya, they do influence reputation, government reputation, for example. There's recent studies which push this propagation strategy argument that Shabaab's sole aim is to provoke the Kenyan government into responding in a way that they can allege is excessive and therefore gain support. So I suppose it's not just down to propaganda. So there's a garbled answer to your difficult question.
I wonder if you can extend the answer of that question a little bit, Topher, to Gloria's question about sort of how the communities felt about the strategies of Al-Shabaab and whether the communities I mean, I think the conclusion was that they didn't feel a lot of pressure from the influence of Al-Shabaab, but I don't know if you had anything more to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, the communities felt, one, that they hadn't, the evidence was that they hadn't received Al-Shabaab information, or at least did not acknowledge that they'd received, or that they knew people who had received Al-Shabaab information. And we worded the questions in a way that tried to account for subjectivity bias, or also for efforts, concerns over self-incrimination. So people weren't answering about themselves; they were also answering about others receiving that information. So, firstly, they didn't feel there was any influence because they didn't acknowledge having received any information. And the actual violence, those sort of 3 or 4 attacks in early August and sort of late June and July. So those did not come up in key informant interviews. They did not come up in the survey very often, although we can say there was some correlation between areas worst affected and the areas where people said they were most concerned about Shabaab, which is obviously not particularly surprising. I think one final finding which might be worth noting is, if we, after months of looking at the data, I noticed that those who identified Al-Shabaab as their greatest concern were less likely on average than those who identified another fear like political violence or a clan conflict as a major concern. So those who mentioned Shabaab as their main concern were ultimately less likely to say that they were willing to participate in future elections, which I think is worth noting. But no, broadly in terms of the results, minimal to no impact whatsoever.
I think something to note from myself, something I found interesting in thinking about the report and the findings, was that it was a really interesting with the security monitoring data to see, that the levels of violence were somewhat less, and that the direct threat of violence perhaps wasn't the most influential factor or a overly influential factor. But it would be very interesting to explore sort of whether or how much influence Al-Shabaab has in sort of influencing clan decisions and clan, perspectives on voting, because you could see the difference in between the male voters and the female voters on how much they voted in line with the clans. And if the clans are participant in this sort of negotiated democracy process where the clan elders have such an influence over how people vote, is Al-Shabaab influencing that process? I think that would be something that would be very interesting to explore, and sort of the nuances of how people of different genders vote with the clan or don't vote with the clan, and how that impacts the voting and the outcome of voting. It would be interesting to further explore.
And if I can just comment on that, there has been quite a lot of research on Shabaab's efforts to manipulate clan dynamics. Not enough research, and as a result, we are under this new program going to be looking at that very question. And I think what you've said, Jess, is really key, that we make sure we incorporate the sort of gender dynamic into that study, to sort of, because it's clear that clan allegiance has a different impact on men and women. So hopefully that there will be study upcoming that will look at that issue. And Jess, recognizing that we're just running out of time, to conclude from my side, I just wanted to do some thank yous as the sort of author of the report, to say thank you so much to obviously to REINVENT and to the UK government who fund REINVENT, and obviously Tetra Tech for all their support on from that side. And then also to UN Women for coming in and helping us conduct this survey and bringing the gender component more strongly, which has clearly revealed some really interesting findings. But also to Grey Dynamics, who conducted a lot of the initial security analysis and the key informant interviews. And finally, obviously you, Jess, for making sure that the gender component actually made sense throughout the study in what was really a really complex piece to write. Martina Zoyton, Jess, Jess, and Mikey Jones for reviewing, and obviously Timothy Kimaiyo here with me. So thank you to everyone, and I can't wait to have the report published and online.
Great, thanks, Topher. Ahmed, Timothy, did you have any last words, or we're about out of time here? But if not, we'll just say, go ahead, Ahmed, did you want to say something?
No, I wanted to reiterate what Topher said, and it was a pleasure being part of this, and hopefully we can do more in the future.
Yeah, as also for me, I'll say the report will be out, and I think maybe we need to do future studies in this space, so that perhaps we can unpack more on what we found in this one. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'll say thank you to Jaki and Marta for joining us today. Thank you for your support of the report. The report will be published at that website. We put in the link. And we're looking forward to having everyone keep following the projects and the outputs of the team from RUSI in Nairobi. So thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and we will see you again. Have a good